Hello, and welcome to Top Identity Security Myths Debunked. Today's webinar is sponsored by SentinelOne and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I am excited to be your moderator for this timely discussion. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you've asked. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we will provide further technical assistance. Now, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to a few from SentinelOne. There's an Active Directory security checklist, there's an Introducing Identity to Your Cybersecurity Strategy document, and there's a document about deception technology and how it's a critical component of a modern cybersecurity stack. So those will be available to you for the entire webinar, but I would recommend grabbing them now if you're interested so you don't forget later. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. Official terms and conditions can also be found in your handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll see the terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of an event like this is an opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. And so to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize that's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So after the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's important presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Joseph Salazar, who's Technical Marketing Engineer at SentinelOne. And I'll also mention we're lucky to be joined by Michael Leland, who's Head of Technical Marketing at SentinelOne. Michael will be on in the background answering your questions in chat during the live event. So Joseph, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, I'll turn things over to you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we see the title slide? Okay, hello, my name is Joseph Salazar. I have been in security for a very long time, both private and public sector, particularly in the military. I've got a lot of experience in counterintelligence, military intelligence, and cybersecurity, so you'll hear a lot of my experiences being brought out as I talk about the topics that we are discussing today. And like I said, I have been as a practitioner for over 20 years doing incident response, computer forensics, cybersecurity, general cybersecurity. So this is our agenda. Today, we're going to talk about why we need identity security, and it's not what you think. What it is, what identity security actually is, the way it's defined nowadays. Common myths and misconceptions, and then we're going to talk a little bit about shifting left. And then questions at the end. So why do we need identity security? Well, the statistics show that attackers are successfully compromising identities on a regular basis. In fact, we're seeing many recent breaches where attackers have succeeded because they are targeting identities. They're compromising enterprise on-premises and cloud identities at increasing rates, and the trend shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, in this statistics slide, you'll see that there is a study by EMA, and that shows that half of the businesses have experienced an attack targeting their Active Directory in the last 2 years, and quite a few of them have succeeded. And in fact, the need is so great that a vast majority of businesses plan to increase spending for their Active Directory security. And as we all know, Active Directory is one of the most used identity management systems in the world. And the cloud also has its share of identity-related breaches. Gartner's estimating that most, if not a vast majority of cloud security failures will result from improperly configuring identity security. So what makes identity security so hard? Well, the first part is pretty obvious. 84% of organizations that have experienced an identity-related breach in the last year, according to the Identity Security Alliance Trends in Cybersecurity survey, of those, 78% stated that they had a direct business impact. And that's a lot if you consider 84%, of which 78% had a direct business impact because of an identity-related breach. 4.5 million. This is how much it costs for an average data breach attributed to compromised credentials. This includes cleanup and any ransoms paid. And what makes that hard? Well, first of all, your enterprise has more identities than it has actual users. I think the last estimate was the average enterprise has between 3 and 5 times the number of identities accounts than it does actual users. So if you consider every user has an account, every system, at least in Active Directory, has an account. You've got cloud accounts, right? You've got, which are federated sometimes. You have admin accounts, so separate use privileged accounts, right? And you've got specific service accounts. So that massive pool of enterprise accounts, identities, is what the attackers are going after. And I mentioned cloud briefly, cloud environment vulnerabilities, right? Besides being in AWS or Google, a lot of companies now are using Azure Active Directory, right? And misconfigurations in any of the IAM functions within those environments can often lead to a compromise on your on-premises enterprise because of federation, particularly in something like Azure Active Directory, where one user has an account, that account gets synced to the Azure Active Directory, and an attacker that manages to compromise that Azure Active Directory account has direct access to all of the enterprise assets. You have attackers using advanced techniques, right? You've probably heard of things like golden ticket attack, silver ticket attack, DC sync, DC shadow, AS rep roasting, skeleton key attacks. These have 2 things in common. They're extremely difficult to detect, and most of them are identity-based attacks. And the reason why attackers use them is because it's a lot simpler to break into a system by pretending or impersonating a legitimate user than it is to try to find a 0-day or create an exploit. It just takes much less work, and so it reduces the bar to entry in order to breach an enterprise. Poor identity security hygiene. Now, unless you are in a regulated industry, the chances of you having done an audit in your IAM or Active Directory is pretty low. Probably haven't done one in the last 5 years. Regulated industries usually do it every year because it's a requirement for the compliance, but most companies don't. And if you think about all of the mergers and acquisitions that happen, if you are a merging entity and you take on a smaller entity, you've inherited their Active Directory and any exposures and vulnerabilities, not only on the on-premises Active Directory, but also in their cloud. And then finally, privileged identity management issues. And we'll get into this a bit more, but most organizations don't use a PAM, right? They don't use a privileged access management system. And for those that do, they don't have every single user with administrative rights in that PAM system, right? So you have what are called delegated permissions or delegated admin rights. Now, you can do something like give a user the ability to unlock an account or change a password, but you don't have to add them to the domain admins group. Now, that user can do this for operational reasons, but that account becomes a prime target for an attacker because they know that if they compromise that account, it won't show up as a compromised domain admin, but they will have the ability to, for example, reset a service account password, and now they have service account rights to the organization, or reactivate a dormant domain admin account. So you see, all of these things sort of come together to make identity security very difficult. So what is identity security? I've been talking about it a little bit, but here's a definition based on everything that we've looked at. Identity security is a category of security controls focusing on securing identity data, that's your credentials and passwords, and the identity infrastructure. Now, most of the time, this means Active Directory, but not always. In fact, Gartner's definition of a tool called ITDR gets into that. So there is a blind spot in your current security control coverage, right? On the one hand, you have access protection. You manage your access, right? And so you're making sure that the right people get access to the right things at the right time. And then on the other side, you've got your endpoint protection, which is preventing malicious code and process execution. But nothing in those two security control classes actually protects identities, and that is that protection gap that is filled by identity security. So this is twofold. It's going to reduce the identity attack surface and detect identity-based attacks. So let's start getting into the myths. The first myth, I already do identity security. You think that just because you've got things like IAM, PAM, MFA, and all that other stuff that you're doing identity security. Here's the reality. Current identity management controls do not protect against attacks targeting the infrastructure. That includes things like credential theft and misuse, active directory reconnaissance, attacks targeting the cloud and on-premises identity infrastructure, and things of that nature. So let's go delve into this a little bit. So this is what you're currently doing. Some of you are doing IGA, which is Identity Governance Administration, and that manages and governs identities. Some of you have an IAM, in fact, most of you do, right, which is designed to authenticate and authorize identities. And then some of you have a PAM, which is Privileged Access Management. So this is managing access to privileged identities. You have a safe that you check them out of and you check them back into. They've got password rotation. They've got a timeout, etc. These don't actually protect identities except a subset in PAM. They actually protect access. So if you think about everything that these things do, it's all about access. So according to Gartner, this is what IAM is, right? It's a security and business discipline to give the right assets, to give the right people the right access to the right systems at the right time for the right reasons. And it's really designed to keep unauthorized users from getting in and committing fraud or crimes of some sort. Nowhere in this definition does it actually say protects identities. Let's look at IGA. So IGA is all about administrative controls of digital identities and access rights, right? Look at the mandatory capabilities for a complete IGA suite. You're talking about provisioning and deprovisioning an identity. You're talking about giving it entitlements, supporting access requests. Hey, I need access to this system. Okay, great. We'll give you this right to access that system. It helps with the workflow, so all of this is done smoothly so people can get onboarded easily. You've got access certifications or attestations saying, yes, I've done the appropriate things. You've got analytics and reporting. You've got auditing, etc. These are all compliance requirements that you can meet with an IGA control, right, with an IGA solution. But they don't protect or secure identity. There's nothing in here about identity security. All right, let's look at PAM, right? So PAM is really the only piece of identity security that touches a small subset of privileged accounts that it actually will protect, right? So it's going to try to find all the privileged accounts in your environment. It's going to manage those privileged accounts. It's going to allow you to check them out and check them back in. It's going to monitor their use and record all the stuff that you're doing so that you've got an audit trail of what these privileged accounts actually did. Okay, that's great for users that are identified as privileged accounts. But as I mentioned earlier, not everybody with a privileged right or privileged authority is in a PAM solution, right? Those so-called delegated permissions. So while this does touch on identity security, it is a small subset of users, not your entire infrastructure. So the second myth, EDR can protect identities. This is a big it depends, right? Because it depends on the tools and techniques. It depends on when you're actually getting the detection. It depends on how accurate that detection is going to be and how effective your response is going to be. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. But EDR does have a place, and it will detect things that may target your identities, but not all. This is Gartner's definition of endpoint detection and response. Now, EDR is really a bunch of solutions that look at it from the endpoint perspective. So it's only on the endpoints. It's looking for behaviors. It's looking at the data happening. You know, it's looking at all the logs and activity, and then it's analyzing that for detection capabilities, right? It's going to look for suspicious system behavior. It's going to give you context on what's happening. When this process triggered, what triggered this process? What did it do? And then it's going to try to block that stuff, right? This is not just antivirus. It's also looking at process execution. It's going to give you some quarantine or process killing. It's going to give you remediation suggestions. It might even give you rollback, right? So based on that definition, there are 4 primary capabilities. You're going to detect a security incident. You're going to contain the security incident at the endpoint. You're going to investigate it. And that's what that analysis and detection is about. And you're going to provide remediation guidance, whether you can do rollback or it tells you how to get things back, restore from a shadow copy or something, right? However, while EDR can detect a bunch of things, it doesn't detect all identity security related things, right? So you're going to find malicious applications or processes that are attempting to steal identity information, right? So these have to be binaries that are trying to do something like AD find or Mimikatz or something like that, right? For some, it depends on if there's an existing signature or hash value. For others, it depends on the behavior if it's identified as malicious. And then the application or process is behaving in a suspicious manner, and it has to meet a threshold, right? So this is the behavioral analytics that happens at the endpoint from an EDR perspective. It's going to look at an application, and then it's going to see if that application meets its baseline and it deviates from that baseline, right? So it's attempting to find things like low bins or low BAS, which is living off the land binaries and scripts, right? It's going to have fileless malware. So this is the things it's supposed to detect. But again, only if it meets certain thresholds for detection. However, it is going to miss certain identity-related attacks. Active Directory reconnaissance happens during the reconnaissance phase, but it is an attack activity, right? The attacker is collecting information to use to further their attacks, right? But the way they're doing that is by attacking Active Directory directly, right? EDR is not going to see if an attacker uses built-in tools to access stored credentials that are on the endpoint. For example, I can go and Google for PowerShell to access Credential Manager, and it'll give me a way to create a PowerShell script that will look in Credential Manager on Windows, see what's stored there, and dump that and dump all of that, including the hashes, the stored hashes of those credentials. But because it's PowerShell and it's a built-in application, EDR might miss it. And then, of course, there are legitimate tools that are used for illegitimate purposes, right? Bloodhound is an exceptionally useful tool for network admins, for AD admins. But it does have illegitimate uses because it can allow an attacker to map all of your domain admin and elevated admin accounts and then find ways to elevate their privileges to get to that domain admin. Now, depending on how your exclusions and execution authority and whitelisting, you might miss activities like this. So what else can EDR do? Well, let's talk about containing an incident at the endpoint. Can it terminate malware processes accessing identities? Yes, it can. Can it detect credential theft via legitimate applications? Again, maybe, maybe not. It depends. Can it investigate security incidents? Yes, it can identify processes that are used to access identity data, but it can't actually tell you which identity data or type was accessed. It depends. Maybe, maybe not, right? It can tell you that some data was accessed, but it won't tell you, hey, this account was accessed with a command line. Provide remediation guidance. Yes. Can it clean up malware? Absolutely. It's one of the things that EDR is very good at. Can it prevent the use of stolen credentials? So you know that credentials were stolen. You detected it. Could you stop it from being used? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends. So you notice that there is this gray area with EDR. So EDR, again, the myth was it can stop identity-based attacks. The reality is it depends. So you've heard about this thing called ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. And for a lot of people, they think, oh, this is going to deal with all my identity security needs, right? Identity Threat Detection and Response was introduced by Gartner as a category of security controls that specifically protects identities and identity management systems. And I'll go into a bit more of that a little bit later. But essentially, a lot of people think that ITDR is going to handle all of their needs. Yes and no. So Identity Threat Detection and Response is responsible for defending identities during an attack, right? It only covers half of what Gartner considers the identity fabric immunity principles, right? And if you're not familiar with that, please go ahead and read Gartner's report on it. Identity fabric immunity principles basically says you're going to prevent detect, and respond to identity-based attacks or to attacks targeting the identity fabric. This is using a combination of multiple different security controls, including IAM, MFA, PAM, ITDR, and prevention, security posture management, right? But really, identity attack surface management is an essential prevention capability, and you'll see that in a moment. You need both to actually do identity security because ITDR is just one half of the equation. So ITDR is defined by Gartner, is a security discipline that looks at threat intelligence, best practices, it provides a knowledge base, as well as tools and processes to protect identity systems. Notice here the emphasis on protecting identity systems, right? So you're looking at detection mechanisms, investigation mechanisms, and response mechanisms. So you're going to detect, investigate, and respond to identity-based attacks. Here's an example, right? So you're going to detect and disrupt credential theft and misuse, right? You're going to detect and disrupt Active Directory reconnaissance. You're going to disrupt privilege escalation attempts, and you're going to derail lateral movement that tries to use stolen identities and identity data, right? So the goal here is for efficient detection, efficient protection of identities and identity management systems, right? So you're going to secure them with ITDR. But again, this only applies during an attack. Because again, it's going to detect and respond. Here's where it fits in the security stack, right? You notice that there's a bunch of prevention mechanisms before it actually kicks in. ITDR's responsibility is detection and response. You're going to gather TTPs, you're going to look at behavior, you're going to gather IOCs, and you're going to respond to it with an identity threat playbook. You notice, though, that there is this prevention mechanism that looks at in terms of identity posture management, right? And that is where Gartner defines preventative controls. This is not ITDR, and it's actually in the ITDR report that Gartner created. They specifically say that ITDR is not prevention. There are specific prevention controls for ITDR that focus on misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and exposures. Now, they say that you're looking at misconfigurations, but ensuring that IAM controls are properly configured. You're looking at vulnerabilities. You're addressing commonly exploited vulnerabilities in the identity infrastructure with compensating controls. And of course, you're looking at exposures. You're reducing the attack surface by removing unnecessary access privileges, for example. However, identity attack surface management is specialized in this, right? Identity attack surface management is designed to reduce your identity risks before an attack. This is a prevention mechanism to find exposed passwords, both on the endpoints and in Active Directory. You're going to identify credential attack paths. You're going to find and remediate Active Directory exposures and vulnerabilities, and you're going to find and remediate cloud identity exposures and vulnerabilities, right? And misconfiguration. So this is things like Azure Active Directory, which has its own set of identity databases. So identity attack surface management is the other side of that identity security coin. So again, it's going to reduce identity-related risks. And so to have a good identity security program, you need both. You need identity attack surface management to manage and reduce your identity attack surface, and you need ITDR to defend your identities in real time. Myth number 4. Identity security won't stop credential theft and misuse. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, right, with EDR. Will EDR stop a stolen credential from being misused? The answer is maybe, maybe not. And so some people think that, well, if EDR can't do it, why would identity security be able to stop it? Well, this is where we've got a complementary control called deception. Identity security can be complemented with deception tactics and technologies to actually stop credential theft and misuse, right? It's going to stop the attacker's ability to actually use stolen credentials because you can use deception to hide your high-value identity data, right? So that attackers can't steal it. And if they can't steal it, they can't misuse it. This is things like hiding your domain admin groups, hiding your domain admin users, or hiding the credentials that are stored at the endpoints. And then you can misdirect attackers, right, by creating decoys and fake identity data and fake identity systems, right? And then deception actually is a counterintelligence function. And again, here's that military side. I'll explain to you what counterintelligence is, but basically this is to deny accurate intelligence gathering. The point of counterintelligence is to prevent an adversary from collecting intelligence on you as an organization. And then you have the fact that deception can engage with attackers, so you can collect not only intelligence on their activities, you can record everything that they do to collect forensic evidence. And you can use that forensic evidence to derive TTPs and IOCs. So, what is deception? Well, the definition is basically to lie. It's causing someone to accept as true or valid what is false or invalid. The military definition actually is a bit more apropos to what we're looking at, right? It's actions executed to deliberately mislead adversaries, right? So you're misleading adversary decision makers, causing them to take actions or not take actions that help you to accomplish your mission. Which leads us to cyber deception, right? Cyber deception really is military deception implemented in the cyber realm, right? Deliberate and controlled act to conceal our networks, create uncertainty, confusion against the adversary's efforts to establish situational awareness, and to influence and misdirect adversary perceptions and decision processes, right? By giving them a false idea of what's happening in the network and the data within that network, you are able to detect them faster and you're able to mislead them. Counterintelligence. If you look at this definition, this is cyber deception in a nutshell. Organized activity of an intelligence service designed to block an enemy's sources of information, deceive the enemy, prevent sabotage, and to gather political and military information. For us, in cybersecurity, this is what we're really interested in. We're blocking the enemy's sources of information, we're deceiving the enemy, and we're preventing sabotage. Does that sound like cyber deception? Yes. So cyber deception as a control is initiating counterintelligence actions in your environment. So why deception with ITDR and identity security in general? All right, I'm an attacker. I steal a credential. This gives me unconstrained lateral movement. It doesn't matter what type of credential I get, I can eventually elevate privileges. As long as I've got one credential, that gives me access to the network. Okay, great. You've implemented ITDR. You've got an alert. Okay, you know someone stole a credential or identity data or did something. Can you actually do anything to stop me from using that or from gaining actionable intelligence that I can use to move laterally? No. ITDR gave you an alert. It gives you a response to block off that user or that process. But I've got the information that I need. I can use that information. If I manage to replicate your entire Active Directory database and you detect me and stop me from pulling all of it, I've still pulled some necessary data that I can now use to progress my attack. This is where deception fits in. Deception prevents the attacker from actually gaining valuable operational identity data because it uses fake lures and bait, and it redirects that lateral movement to non-production decoys that you can set up with whatever deceptive information you want that will record everything that they do. So, number 5. So I talked a little bit about identity, security, and all this other stuff, and you think, well, that's kind of complicated, isn't it? Effective identity security does not require expertise or resources, any extra expertise or resources. Identity attack surface management is designed to simplify identity risk reduction, right? There are many different types of identity access management solutions out there, right? From simple things that will look at your Active Directory to things that will actually remediate exposure. ITDR can be very effective from endpoints or the domain controllers, right? Depending on the solution you get, you can protect your Active Directory domain controllers directly, or you can protect the Active Directory database from the endpoints. And then ITDR, if you incorporate it as a component of XDR, you can simplify detection, investigation, and response. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. So, the whole point of identity risk reduction is to simplify reducing risks to your identity attack surface, right? So here's some examples, right? It should be simple to deploy and manage. It shouldn't be difficult to deploy an identity attack surface management solution. It should be simple to install. It should operate in the background. It should be dead simple, right? You should also be able to use the solution to detect on-premises and cloud identity exposures, right? So depending on the solution you choose, there are solutions out there that can detect both on-premises and cloud identity exposures to your Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. These should also be able to remediate your exposures, whether manually or automatically, right? There are a lot of stories I've heard from people who audit Active Directory where they would audit an Active Directory, come back in 6 months or a year to see if the get well plan got followed, and to find a vast majority of the findings weren't fixed because they didn't have time to research it, they didn't have time to deploy it, and they didn't want the downtime involved with certain remediations, right? And then it should have reporting capabilities as well. You should be able to get a full readout of all of your exposures so you can prioritize them. And then, of course, it should tell you what those exposures are, right? You should have the ability to look up that exposure without having to do manual research on your own. So an identity attack surface management tool should have, some of these, if not most or all of these features, because then it helps simplify that risk reduction. The next part is ITDR. This is supposed to make detection simple, right? It's supposed to help with identity protection because ITDR atomic events are not dependent on correlation, but actual detection, right? You should be looking at the activity, specifically targeted activities, right? The reason why some EDR fails to detect some identity-based attacks is because they've got to correlate a bunch of different data and they don't have the rule set, or they haven't been configured to look at certain events in sequence as an identity attack. Whereas an ITDR solution is going to look at that individual activity and say, that's not right. It's not an authorized user. It's not an authorized process. This data should be protected. It's privileged. This is not an elevated user. Therefore, it's a problem. So that type of detection means that it's going to simplify that capability of detecting an identity-based attack, right? These should also be simple to deploy and manage, right? It should be, depending on where you deploy it, you can deploy the domain controller versions on the domain controller, or you can deploy them across your entire environment, but it should fit into your software deployment tool, and you should be able to manage it effectively and simply. In fact, some EDR solutions are now starting to implement or include ITDR functions within their agents. You should be able to detect attacks from any device on the network, right? Because not every device that attacks your identity data, your Active Directory, is a Windows system. You should be able to detect attacks originating from the endpoints or targeting domain controllers, right? So either of those. And you should be able to detect cloud-based identity attacks, right? So not all of the ITDR solutions will have all of these, but you should look for the ones that fit your requirement, because not everyone needs all of these requirements. And really, if you think about it, identity security is a logical evolution of a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy to include it as part of XDR, right? So why should you do that? Well, you're getting visibility, detection, response, and remediation for identity-based attacks if it's part of your XDR solution, right? You're providing identity attack data correlation, root cause analysis, and investigation because you got all of this extra identity-based data in your XDR environment. So now your investigations become much easier to do because you have a more complete picture, which is sort of a misnomer because complete is everything. So you have more of a picture. You see more of the data because you're seeing the identity-related data correlated to identity-based attacks. And you're also getting identity forensic data, right? You know which processes initiated identity-based attacks, right? You've got activity that you can now use to correlate against all of your extra tools and your native capabilities, right? So identity security provides protection for credentials before and during an attack. XDR can take advantage of that visibility and telemetry to coordinate your responses across your entire enterprise. So your native capabilities and any integrated tools within your security stack, like your proxies, your firewalls, right? You should be able to automatically isolate an endpoint and lock an account because of your XDI capabilities. You may even be able to do things like trigger multi-factor authentication re-authentication or SSO, right? You should be able to force them to re-authenticate. Hey, this looks unusual or suspicious. I want to make sure that this user is legitimate. I'm going to trigger MFA. That can stop a lot of identity-related attacks. So let's look at it from an attack timeline perspective. The goal of your security solutions is to shift your detections left. You want to find and stop attacks as soon as possible, right? If you find and stop the attacker sooner, you are less likely to have a costly and massive cleanup. So your standard prevention mechanism, this is things like AV, right? You've got file-based detection, you've got malware detection based on hashes and signatures, etc. Well, this is old school AV. If you have the signature, you can detect it. If you don't have a signature or a hash, that sample doesn't get detected. So we go to behavioral-based detection. This is things like EDR or UEBA or something, right? You're looking for anomalies. This should be able to detect fileless exploits, low bins and low bass, etc., right? Because they're going to behave unusually. But again, the weakness of behavioral detection is that they must meet the detection threshold. The higher the threshold, the fewer false positives, but the more false negatives. The lower the threshold, the more detections, but the more noise. So it's that tight walking, it's a tightrope walking balance of what your SOC can handle and what your analysts will handle. And then you have, once it's gotten past the detection phase, now you have to do your response, right? So you're going to analytics, response, and resolution mechanisms. You want to detect it, you want to analyze it, you want to respond to it, and then you want to recover from it in some way, shape, or form, right? So your IR actions, your rollbacks, your forensics. And then, of course, you've got your XDR with your third-party platforms. You can ingest telemetry. You can coordinate with your third-party responses. You're going to do root cause investigation and analysis. You're going to strengthen your security controls because you've got all this information that you can correlate. You can create new playbooks out of it, and you can help stop attacks in the future. The problem with all of these is that they happen post-boom. They happened after something already got in, right? This is after initial exploitation, after they've started moving around. If I, as an attacker, were conducting identity-related attacks, I've already stolen credentials. I've already queried Active Directory, right, with a simple command, dsgetdc, nltest/dsgetdc tells me what domain controller I'm connected to. net group domain admins /domain gives me a list of all of domain users, the domain users that are domain admins, right? So something has already happened, and this is a little bit late, right? This is not far left enough. This is where identity threat detection and response fits in. This is detecting attacks that target your identities post initial compromise when they start attempting to conduct reconnaissance. And this is the earliest possible time you can detect them if they manage to successfully compromise a system and get inside. They haven't moved around yet. They try to steal a local credential or they try to query Active Directory. You can detect them. You're detecting them because they are targeting identities and the identity infrastructure with attacks, right? A rogue Active Directory query gets detected in this phase. So this is as far left as you can get. So now you can add deception, misdirection, and engagement that works throughout this entire process from reconnaissance all the way through the attack time cycle, right? The attack timeline. And you can see why using deception makes a lot of sense. And so if you look at it in these phases, ITDR detects as early as possible. You have EDR, which is your detection and response, and you have XDR, which sort of helps toward the middle and latter part of the attack timeline. But the earliest you can detect them is through ITDR. And so very briefly then, there are only 2 slides that are going to cover this. SentinelOne has a pretty robust identity security portfolio. We have Ranger AD, which is designed to strengthen your Active Directory defenses. This is our identity attack surface management solution. This will harden your on-premises and Azure Active Directory, and we talk about this as reducing the opportunities for attackers to succeed. The next part is Singularity Identity, which is our identity threat detection and response solution. This will detect and respond to identity attacks. It will defend identities at endpoints and at domain controllers, so it's going to find them early before the attackers can actually exploit these identities. And then finally, we have Hologram, which is our deception technology portfolio function. This will occupy in-network attackers, but it works with our identity solutions, which also uses deception as a tactic. It will create and manage a decoy infrastructure. and it will engage advanced attackers with lures and bait. So this is identity deception and misdirection. So you see, we cover all of the aspects of identity security and we augment it with deception. So from a platform perspective, right, we've got our market-leading EPP and XDR solutions and EDR solutions, right? We are known for autonomous detection, autonomous response. We also have our cloud offering, which is to defend any cloud environment, any cloud workload at any time. And we're one of the few platforms that has identity as a native component to the solution. This is all covered, all shares data with our security data lake, which can also ingest data from any source within our marketplace and any native sources. So our platform provides you full visibility across the entire detection fabric, whether it is a native capability or a market partner. And with this, you can do autonomous detection across all of the attack surfaces, and we also offer an IR and MDR service. So with that, are there any questions? I tried to leave enough time so that if we had questions, we'd have plenty of time to do it. Are there any questions at this time?
Yeah, Joseph, great presentation, great walk through the identity security myths there and some of the SentinelOne solutions. We have one here. They're wondering, isn't MFA enough to stop most identity-based attacks?
So MFA is probably the single greatest thing you can do to stop an identity-based attack. The problem is, and this is according to the Identity Security Alliance, adoption of MFA is relatively low. And there are weaknesses to certain MFA technologies. Like if you get SIM swapped, someone can intercept your MFA token that's being sent to you via SMS and log in as you, right? And this actually happens relatively frequently now. And it's actually one of the vectors and tactics that attackers do use is SIM swapping so that they can access and, for example, steal your bank account information because they can intercept that token. So the MFA is not an end-all be-all solution, but it is one of the things that you can do, right? The problem with MFA is that it is required during what's called an interactive login. And there are certain activities that are interactive where you are typing on the keyboard and that it prompts you for a password. But there are other things that are non-interactive logins, such as if an application requires to authenticate to a server, right? Like an Outlook client on your on your endpoint has to authenticate to the Outlook server. And so to do that, it has to store a token because it can't do MFA because there's no interactive login. So things like that, where it's talking machine to machine, that is a big weakness. But you want to use MFA because it's still one of the best ways to protect your identity infrastructure.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned something about hiding identity data from attacks, but isn't that data necessary for regular users? How can you ensure that only the right people can see or access the hidden identity data, but the attackers can't?
So depending on the technology that you use, whether, the deception technology, that you should have a whitelisting capability, right? So we actually have, and I can only speak of it from our perspective because I only have access to the tools that we offer. But our whitelist actually allows specific users or specific groups to access that hidden identity data. Regular users shouldn't be impacted because it's their profile. They have authorized rights to it. But anyone that's accessing anything on the endpoint or the Active Directory domain database that is not on that whitelist, or they're using an application that's not authorized, isn't actually going to see anything of value. So based on whitelisting and the capabilities of the technology you're using, you should be able to give access to the right people at the right time for those assets.
Okay, super. We have a question here from Dennis, who's asking, Joseph, what you think is the best way for non-regulated companies management to be convinced that they need to do audits on their identities and their Active Directory?
So I would say do a red team or pen test. So I used to be a red teamer and pen tester in my Army career. I never failed to break into a network where I was able to successfully compromise an identity. If you conduct a red team or pen test, chances are they're going to go after Active Directory. It's one of the first things that they will do, right? If I can pull a list of your domain admins using nothing more than a command line command, because every user has access to that database, I now have a target list that I can go after, right? And so run a pen test, run a red team exercise, or just do an audit, and you'll see how many things are in your Active Directory that don't belong there. I mean, you might have SMB version 1 and version 2 still active, right? You might have legacy permissions or legacy accounts that are deactivated, but you know that you can reactivate a domain admin account. It doesn't take much to do it. You just need someone who has reactivation rights, and it doesn't have to be a domain admin. So if I do that, I've got full access to your entire domain. So do a red team or a pen test. It's the surest way to convince somebody that their Active Directory is wide open, because it is.
Okay. Next question here from Vinod, who's, and I think this came up a little bit in the MFA question, but what's the best way to secure service and systems accounts or system accounts?
Service and system accounts are tricky. And the reason why is because you need them to operate, to authenticate specific services onto specific servers. The problem is that, at least in Active Directory, you have to authorize services. And so the best way to protect them is to severely limit what they have access to. Most service accounts are given blanket permissions and are put into a service account group within Active Directory. I say provide service accounts as individual account rights only. Give them access to a specific server or a specific service on a specific IP, and only access to specific data, and only read access for the most part, because a service account should never have write access unless that service has a legitimate need to write to the database. Most service accounts don't. So it really comes down to how well you manage that service account from a rights and permissions perspective. Most accounts are over provisioned, service accounts and regular accounts. They just have way too many permissions that they don't need. And they inherit permissions. Most people don't realize that they inherit permissions within an Active Directory infrastructure because of hierarchical nature of groups, to group permissions to user permissions. So a user that is just a regular user might belong to a group, and because that group has certain elevated permissions, that user has implicit elevated permissions. So yeah, you really need to, and this is where an Active Directory audit comes in. You need to severely limit the permissions you provide to accounts.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, make sure that you're applying the principle of least privilege.
Absolutely. And this is where things like IAM and IGA really can help. This is where you want to be as restrictive as possible. Give them what they can use and no more.
Yeah. Okay, super. Hey, we probably got time for another question here. And they're asking, we do Active Directory audits annually, but fixing everything the auditors find is difficult and time consuming. How does identity attack surface management make it easier?
All right. So at least from our perspective, we will actually automatically remediate. So let me talk about it from what we detect first. So our identity attack surface management tool, which is Ranger AD, will look at over 200 different on-premises and Azure Active Directory exposures. Right? It's going to look for all of these exposures, and it's going to identify. So there's approximately 45 Azure, 40 Azure Active Directory exposures that we all identify, and there's over 90 on-premises Active Directory exposures that we'll identify. And then for a subset of those, we can actually automatically remediate them. For the rest, we'll actually give you the remediation steps, because there's certain things that you have to go in there and do manual remediation, because there's no way that a PowerScript can actually do it. For the rest, we'll actually generate the script and automatically trigger it with a rollback function, right? So an IDASM solution should have the ability to find and remediate the exposures in your Active Directory, and if not, at least give you the references on how to fix them. And like I said, I've heard it from many auditors where they will go back and look at the audit findings and find that most of them haven't been touched. At least this way, you're getting a continuous assessment of your Active Directory on a weekly or whatever basis, and you're going to be able to remediate it, and then you're going to see your score, and you're going to see how you're improving your score every time you make a remediation. And if the score goes up, oh, something new showed up. We need to go and investigate it, right? So these tools do have a purpose, and they are going to really significantly reduce your Active Directory risks, your identity attack surface risks.
Okay. All right. Super. Well, Joseph, you've been really generous with your time here. Just we're probably up on time here, but if somebody wants to get started with SentinelOne or kick the tires, what do you recommend?
So I would suggest going to our website. Here's a QR code and URL for those of you who want to go and learn more. You can always reach out to us. Our contact information is on the webpage, and we're more than happy to talk to you about identity security. Again, we know that there are quite a few other identity security solutions that are starting to show up in the market because, again, this is a relatively new field, but you'll probably want to go with the solution that helped identify and define the ITDR category for Gartner, and that would be SentinelOne. We were one of the ones that actually helped define that category. And so we understand very, very tightly how we can secure identities. So please reach out to us, and we're more than happy. We have plenty of resources both here in the webinar and on our website. So please reach out to us, and we're more than happy to help further.
Yep. All right. Yeah, and just a quick call out to the resources and the handouts as well. So grab this QR code if you can, and you can grab those handouts too. Joseph, thank you so much for coming on, walking us through these myths, and telling us about SentinelOne. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, and I'm going to leave that QR code up there while we take care of the Amazon gift card prize drawing. So if you didn't get a chance to get your phone out yet, we want to give you a few more seconds to be able to get it out there and grab that QR code. But the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Peter Young from Pennsylvania. So congratulations to Peter Young. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank SentinelOne for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.